Welcome to another edition of the Album of Record podcast. I'm Craig Lindell, and I am joined by Andrew Schnitke. How's it going, Andrew?
Going pretty good. I don't know if we're going to get an obligatory Pearl Jam mention in this one, so I'll just say that I'm really excited because a new Pearl Jam song is coming out at midnight tonight. So looking forward to that.
Our streak of being a Pearl Jam podcast is intact.
In case anybody gets the drinking game going, I just wanted to make sure they could get a drink in this episode. So
shots.
Don't want anybody going thirsty.
So this week we decided to talk about a recently proposed law. It's called the Living Wage for Musicians Act of 2024. And it's a law that totally touches on everything that we believe and everything that we've talked about. You and I are on record on this podcast already saying that we think, based on our previous purchasing habits, that we should have to pay more for streaming than what we pay now. Just because for guys like you and me, streaming represented the biggest bargain of all time. And I love a bargain, don't get me wrong, but finding that balance between my fandom and making sure that the artists that I love can continue to provide the music, and they can provide their lifestyle enough subsistence so that they can make the art that I love. I mean, I'm wearing the Saturdays at Your Place t-shirt today. I went and saw a small band from Detroit on Sunday night, and I buy these t-shirts as a way of putting extra money in their pockets because I streamed their album 100 times or so, and there was no other way for me to give them money straight out of Spotify. So, I can't read that. Who is that?
This is my Infant Island shirt that I got. I got it when I bought their record because that album is so good that I wanted to support them more because I'm in the same boat. I don't feel like Spotify pays them enough for how much enjoyment I get out of listening. So I added on a t-shirt to go with it.
Yeah. So let me kind of run through what we know about this proposed law. We're going to skip the part about talking about who proposed the law. It was Rashida Tlaib, who is divisive and controversial in some corners of the world. And you and I don't care about that part of it. We care about the text of the bill. So it's called the Living Wage for Musicians Act of 2024. And broadly speaking, it sets up a fund that is a collection of funds from the streaming companies, and it serves to compensate two types of artists: named artists, registered artists, like the name, and then also it's kind of like the session players, so the non-named artists, and they look to fund that. They call it eligible featured artists and eligible non-featured artists. And so this fund, how are you going to put money in there? Well, they have a kind of a tax on streaming that's 50% of the subscription fee, subject to a minimum of $4 and a maximum of $10. So each one of us who pay Spotify $10 a month or $20 a month, if you're on the family plan or you're on the singles plan, would pay $5 or $10 a month, presumably. And that money would go straight into the fund. And then in addition to that, because Spotify has a lot of customers on the ad-supported tier, the streaming companies are required to take 10% of their non-streaming revenues, and that ends up going into this fund as well. And then that fund would end up compensating these artists. Now, there's no way for us this might never happen. It might just be a pie in the sky deal, and it might never hit the front burner. It's probably not the biggest priority for our Congress. So I don't know. I guess first things first, Andrew, what did you think after you kind of read the bill and read about the bill?
So I think at my first gut instinct, and again, we will steer this as clear of politics as we can, but at first I was a little bit like, it's a little bit interesting to me, the government imposing what somebody has to charge for their subscriptions. However, I will say we have minimum wage, and musicians aren't subject to minimum wage, but this is a way of bringing a minimum wage, if you will, to musicians, and that's something I'm all for. I think that's also partially why this will be tricky politically to get this to get passed. We're a very divided country right now. The House of Representatives could not be any closer between the two parties. In fact, I believe the Republicans have 1 seat advantage right now at the moment due to some vacancies. And I think this is going to be a hard bill to get Republicans on board with. So I think it is going to be a difficult bill to get through. But having said that, I personally would love to see this happen. We've Craig already alluded to this. We talked about this before. Like, I wish on their own Spotify would just charge more. It's crazy to me that I can have all the music in the world for $10 a month. And before streaming, I know that I was buying at least one MP3 album a week. Before that, when it was CDs, I was buying multiple CDs a month. I was spending a lot more than $10 a month on music, and that was for a very limited selection of music. So, spiritually, ideologically, I'm all in favor of this. I'd love to know. Like, I have no idea. I have not. I don't know if this is publicly available information. Do you know, Craig, what percentage of Spotify users are paid users? So, like, and as a result, like, what's that breakdown right now in revenue? Like, is this going to hit Spotify harder on the 50% of the non-sub fees? So presumably that means ad revenue and whatever other merchandise sales come through for Spotify, versus the 50% increase to our subscription fees.
All right. So first, the answer to your question, Spotify has, and this is older. This is April 2023. Spotify had 515 million monthly active users, and 210 million premium subscribers, 317 million on the ad-supported plan.
Okay. So was that like 40%? Some amazing quick math there. I'm probably way off. I don't know.
No, it says 40% in the next line.
Oh, there we go. All right. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see how the streaming services would react to this. For Spotify, does it make sense for them to get rid of the ad-supported tier and just push everybody into a paid tier and charge more for that paid tier? What does that do to Spotify's user base, and how does that compare to, obviously Apple, Tidal, Amazon, some of these other ones? So
I thought
that's
a lot
something
about that, and I don't think Spotify would care. It just means that they've got a 10% commission on all their ad revenue that they have to pay to this fund. Now, here's the question. Spotify is a streaming company, and this is a music bill. So if they achieve ads on their podcasts, do they have to pay 10% of the ads from the podcast? I would think not. Do they get to sequester sides of the business that are not music if this is limited to music? The other thing that I wonder is what does this do for their arbitrary rules? So I'm a musician. I'm a very small time musician, but I've uploaded music to all the streaming services, and Spotify recently changed the rules that you don't even get paid on the first 1,000 streams. So you have to be over 1,000 to get paid at all. And I think that's garbage. It doesn't really impact my life that much, but I do think it's garbage. And I guess most artists who don't get over 1,000, are kind of your hobbyist level artists anyway. However, it seems to me if you're going to establish something like this and you're going to look to accomplish solving issues like this, you also maybe have to attack some of those arbitrary rules. YouTube has arbitrary rules as well, where you have to have a certain number of channel subscribers or a certain number of annual minutes viewed on their platform before you're allowed to monetize anything. So even with this rule in place, there's still all kinds of arbitrary hurdles that artists have to jump over to get paid for the first X number of streams of their things.
Yeah, there's also in this, there is a maximum payout for the artists per track per month. And the idea behind that is the end goal of this is to get it to where the minimum is 1 cent per stream. That's kind of where this wants to get to. I believe right now it is 0.003 cents per stream. So obviously that's a massive increase to get that to 1 cent per stream. And in order to do that, what they had to do was put a maximum, because otherwise, Taylor Swift is just going to absorb all of this cost, and it's not really going to proportionately help the people that this is trying to help. Taylor Swift doesn't need help with, regardless of whether it's fair to her or not. She doesn't need the help that some of these bands, we've talked about this in the past, like how many bands that we love and like go to, and we think of them as rock stars, they work they have to use vacation time from their jobs to go on tour, so for people like that, it's going to make a huge difference to get up to 1 cent per stream. So I think that's a rule that's been put into place that might counteract the need for the floor. By putting in the ceiling, does it either totally get rid of the floor, or does it reduce the floor? Maybe it's lower than 1,000 streams. I don't know. I don't know how that all would still have to get worked out, but that's kind of where my mind goes with this in terms of trying to be more equitable to all artists of all different sizes.
Yeah, it's a great idea. It's just the devil's in the details. The devil's always in the details. And you and I have talked about this before too, where Spotify pools all their revenue, and then their agreement with the labels that they've made deals with is that they pay out 70% of their revenue back to the artists, and they keep 30% to cover their overheads and their costs and all the different things. Now, when they pool all that money, what you and I have talked about is if people are streaming disproportionately Taylor Swift, again, somebody I like, but I don't listen to her that often, certainly not on my Spotify. So how much of my annual money is going to Taylor Swift, The Weeknd, and some of the most popular artists in the universe who I don't actually listen to? And why is there not more of a one-to-one relationship? Like if I listen to Saturdays at Your Place and you and I both listen to Infant Island 90% of the time, why shouldn't 90% of our actual dollars go just to those artists as opposed to into a pool where now the most popular artists in the world, some of which are being played on the ad tier, are racking up the dollars and essentially taking away from the people that you and I listen to.
Yeah, I certainly think that would be something I personally would love to do it that way. And again, well, I'm not going to, almost went down a political road. I don't want to go down with that. I'll just
go
say,
for it. You can do that here.
I'm not going to open that door. We'll leave that one alone. I do though think as you were talking about that, my mind went to another place though, that I do think is kind of interesting, because that money and those arrangements are still in place with the record labels, and that money is still going to go to the record labels. They're still going to get their money. I think it's I don't think we've mentioned this, but it's worth pointing out. The way this would work is Spotify, and we're going to keep saying Spotify, but we're really using that as sort of a substitute for all streaming services, because this will apply to everybody. This is not just a Spotify thing. So these streaming services will not be paying these artists directly as a part of this act. Instead, it will all go into one central fund. I forget what, I think they haven't had a name for it, maybe not, but basically it's a registry that's going to oversee all of this. So the way this will work is every quarter, every streaming service has to pay whatever their amount is for this. We'll call it a tax. This tax goes into a central fund. Then that's whoever is overseeing this central fund will then pay that money directly to the artist. So the labels are not involved in this at all in that flow, but the labels are still going to get their money. Like this, in order for Spotify, Apple, any Tidal, any of these to be able to do it, they have to have an agreement with the record labels, and the record labels are going to get paid. They are not going to let you stream this music without them getting theirs. So that's kind of where, you know, Spotify is going to have to figure that out as well, because like I said, that money still has to go to the record labels. So, you know, I could foresee a situation in which they use this as an opportunity to raise their subscription fees even beyond, you know, the up to $10 that they can. They may on their own, independent of that, raise it even more and then just hit that $10 cap and just say, hey, sorry, that's the government tax on this.
So first of all, it's called the Artist Compensation Royalty Fund.
There we go.
But
I can't believe I couldn't remember that.
I know it's so catchy, it just rolls right off the tongue.
That's right.
But the other thing that I think about is a lot of these major artists, the ones that require crazy amounts of marketing and crazy amounts of video and touring support, they're on what the industry calls 360 deals, where they're paid a certain amount per year, and then the label partakes in every revenue stream, from streaming to videos on YouTube to album sales to even t-shirt sales while they're on tour. Everything. If they do a sponsorship deal with Maybelline in the arena tour for a pop star, which I've actually seen makeup deals before when my wife and I used to go to these pop shows at basketball arenas. It's it's got to be hugely profitable brand deal for the artist, for the label, when they're putting on a tour. And so the label on a 360 deal gets to partake in all of that stuff. So is a label going to, if they're on a 360 deal with an artist and an artist signs up for this, are they just going to get all that money too? And how would this fund keep the labels from getting their hands on that, because it wasn't designed to go to any labels? I mean, I don't know how any of this is going to work out.
That's really the tricky part of this, is the labels. And I think they announced this, what, Tuesday? I think it was this
Monday
week. I actually think it was Tuesday. So it's not like we've had a chance to read like a lot of in-depth, you know, analysis of this. It's still very raw, fresh, and new. But I've not seen any of the articles I looked at have not mentioned the record labels in this, and I think that's interesting, because if you're looking for the monkey's paw, that could be the monkey's paw in this. Could be how the labels handle this. And you know, I think at times I come across as being very anti-record label, and I'm, in some ways I am. Like, I do think a lot of their business models are somewhat antiquated compared to how bands do business today. But in the situation of an established artist, and where a record label is bringing these opportunities to the artist, you know, when you mentioned the Maybelline, you know, when it's the label that has the partnership with the parent company of Maybelline, and they bring that deal, that sponsorship deal, to the artist, of course the record label should get paid in that. I mean, I totally agree. They should get paid. And you know, when they're putting up money to bring in a very expensive producer to work on an album that the band couldn't afford on their own, like, absolutely, like, the record label's entitled to, you know, get their share out of that. The issue is just that none of this is talking about the labels. So the labels are being left out of this situation. And so it's just, you know, when you look at the economics of this, the supply and demand, this has a very real chance of severely impacting that supply and demand equation. But it's so hard for us to predict without knowing those actual details. Like how is that supply and demand going to change? Like if these prices do have to go up in Spotify, while Craig and I are more than happy to pay more for it, are you going to see a mass exodus at that point? Are people going to say, you know what, I don't need all the music in the world at my fingertips, I'll just buy Taylor Swift album when she puts one out, or whoever your favorite artist is. Like I'll just pick my 5 favorite artists when they put out music, and I'll listen to them, and that'll be that, because maybe at that point the financial equation makes more sense for them there. So that's sort of there could always be unintended consequences to these things that we're not even thinking about yet. I mean, these are just the first ones that come to my mind, but there could be more that we haven't even thought about yet.
Well, and to your point, I mean, taking a $10 a month streaming service and turning it on a dime into a $15 a month streaming service is a huge deal for a lot of consumers.
Mm-hmm.
Now, giant music fans, you're right, giant music fans like us, it wouldn't affect me. It does affect me. It wouldn't affect my buying decision, is what I should say. But for every me, there's maybe 100 people where it would absolutely affect their buying decision, and all of a sudden it wouldn't become worth it. You think about me at a different time in my life, in my early 20s. I've got the gray hair to prove it now, that I can afford an extra $4 or $5 a month for the amount of music, especially compared to the $15, $16, $17 per CD I used to pay. But that's just not the financial reality for everybody. It's not, the financial reality is different than when you and I were in our 20s, and everything does cost more. And so I think you're right. If this pushes everybody to the ad-supported tier, does that force the industry to suffer more than it would if it was just left alone as it is? It's hard to predict these kinds of things. Then again, I'm very much in the camp of never let perfect be the enemy of good. If you're trying to accomplish something, I'll never argue against trying. You can always adjust and keep adjusting and keep adjusting. But I don't, is there a case to be made that we just don't need to do anything, and that artists are able to make it work through Patreon? They're able to work without labels more and more, and that this is much ado about nothing?
It's so hard for me to see it that way because of how.
And for the record, I don't see it that way either.
I know you don't. I know,
but I'm asking the question just because I figure it needs to be asked.
When you're as invested in these artists as we are, and we follow them on social media, and we read subscribe to emails and get newsletters that get put out, we see firsthand how hard the struggle. It is hard to make a living as a touring artist, and that's at a level at which you are big enough that you can headline a tour that plays all across the country and plays decent sized clubs, not stadiums, not arenas, things like that. But even like, maybe this is a bad example, but just thinking about a band like Cloud Nothings that has had endless amounts of just ultimate praise from critics, fans, one of the more well respected rock bands. They tour all over the place. But like a band like that, like we see like how their lives are not much different from ours. They I don't know if Dylan has a day job, but I think Jason does. I think but the point being just that you see the way they tour. It is not an extravagant, glorious experience being on tour with some of these bands. I mean, I follow so many bands on Instagram, and when I see them post pictures of their van that they're touring in, and it's 4 or 5 people just crammed into this van, taking turns driving while everybody else tries their best to get a couple hours of sleep. Like, it is not a healthy lifestyle at all being on tour. They can't eat well, they can't get exercise. I mean, other than playing their shows. It's very difficult. So I don't feel like they are getting compensated in a way that equals what they put into this work. It is truly being done for the love of music, and I appreciate that spirit, but if this can make it just a little bit easier for them, this to pull the West Wing, for anybody who remembers the West Wing, when they talked to the dad who was trying to put his daughter into college, and he talked to them about how he said, it's supposed to be hard. I'm glad it's hard. It's the challenge that molds you, but it should just be a little bit easier. And that's kind of like what I often think about this. Like, if there's got to be something that could just make this a little bit better for the artists. And so I'm with you. Like, this doesn't have to be perfect. Like, let's give this a shot. Let's see what it can do. I want to see more sympathy and empathy from the streaming services too. I mean, granted, we're not, in any form of leadership with these companies. We don't know exactly what their financials look like, but I don't often sense a lot of empathy from the streaming services towards the artists. And maybe it doesn't help that, a lot of these streaming services are, they're public companies that serve, the ultimate, stock price. So that can make it difficult sometimes to say, well, what if we cut into these revenues a little bit to make it a little bit easier for the artist? But at the same time, like, to my knowledge, I don't know that Spotify is even profitable yet. So from their end, like, they're still trying to even figure that out. So it's a messy equation, and I guess this was a long-winded answer to your question, but I don't think to me, it does not feel tenable to just keep the situation going forever. I think we're going to hit a tipping point where we're going to see small bands just say, this just isn't worth it to do this model.
Yeah. And that's what I worry about most, is the bands quitting and not being able to do it anymore. But I also, far be it from me to take the side of the giant corporation, but the origin story matters. And us crusty old guys remember that it sunk to a point where nobody was paying anything for music ever. It was just free. And so now that you've got, even when the quote unquote free music you get on YouTube is ad supported and it's raising funds, and you've got ad supported music on Spotify, the heyday of radio and Camelot music in the mall is never coming back. And before we got to this point where people were paying for Spotify and Spotify was paying 70% of their revenues out and Apple Music was paying a penny per stream, nobody was paying anything for music ever. And so I think a lot of these companies are like, well, we actually brought money back into the equation. And yes, you can't rebuild the model where artists become millionaires. I remember an interview with Ben Folds that I know I've brought up with you before, once upon a time, but he obviously made it big in the 90s with Ben Folds 5 and then had his solo records, and he apologized to the next generation. He's like, I'm sorry that there's no lottery ticket sitting out there anymore. We were the last generation, the last lucky generation of musicians who could torture ourselves in a van and build a fan base around the country and score a top 5 hit on the radio and become millionaires. And it just essentially doesn't happen anymore. Statistically, that number is now 0. The number was very remote even back in the 90s, but it was a lot higher. It was a lot higher. So it's messy. There's no clean answers. I don't necessarily feel sorry for Eck and the Spotify team, but I do understand that, they actually brought some money back into the equation when it had all disappeared, and they weren't responsible for making it disappear, as far as I can tell.
I am often very knee-jerk defensive of the streaming services. Like, like this whole time as I'm sitting here saying, I would like to see a little bit more empathy coming out of the streaming services. I also don't like it when I see artists, and this is going to sound bad, but it's just the truth. When I see artists solely blame the streaming services for their financial situations, because I don't feel that that's entirely fair. Spotify did not create the digital music experience. You know, that that Pandora's box was already open a long time ago.
I'm hoping that none of you can hear any of this, but we keep getting cut off and restarting. So one of the things that you and I have talked about is how Spotify specifically and Apple's harder to figure out because it's a division within a larger company. But Spotify has rebuilt the revenue in music. And when going back to like the 2013, 2014 timeframe, their revenue in euros, I can't find it in dollars, unfortunately, but it was kind of that 750 million euros to a billion euros. And here in 2020, well, I don't know about 2024, obviously, because we're just in the beginning of it, but in 2023, it was over 13 billion euros. So 70% of that is now going into the music marketplace. And because streaming, I know streaming feels like it's not so new anymore, but it's still a developing market. It's not like they came in and stole that revenue from somebody else. It's a market that they're helping build along with Apple Music, along with Amazon Music, and um, YouTube Music. Amazon Music was really going there for a while because of the integration with Alexa. So maybe as this market just continues to mature, some of the things would have taken care of themselves. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I I just know, like, you talk about like the Amazon model. You know, I even remember like for a while there, you know, when Apple first started doing iTunes and the iPod, and they had very strict rights management on the music files that you purchased. So when you purchased something from iTunes, you could only play it in iTunes. You could not play it on another computer. And that caused some frustration and some headaches. So I remember when Amazon came out with their MP3 service, you would buy an album, and a lot of times they even had, for a while, when you bought a CD from Amazon, you would unlock the MP3 version in their economy. But the thing about their economy was they had very loose rights restrictions, so you could take that music and play it elsewhere. So for a while they certainly were popping off, but I think what ultimately happened was, as people figured out how to acquire free music, they realized, well, I don't need either of these services. You know, the iTunes service no longer made sense. The Amazon one no longer made sense, because why should I pay for any of this? I can just go online and download it for free. And that was right before, I remember the day I first heard about Spotify, because it was so mind-blowing to me as a concept and I quite frankly never thought it would work here in the US, because I never thought the labels would get on board. But what had to happen for this to work was, it was getting so bleak for the labels, because so much music was getting pirated, that they said, look, if we can stick our heels in the ground here on this, but like, the genie's out of the bottle, we're not coming back from this. Like, we're not going to monetize the Pirate Bay or LimeWire or any of these things. Like, it's not going to happen. We're not going to get money from that. So what happens if we just, let's work with these companies and figure out something where it's more beneficial to the people to use a streaming service than it is to pirate music? And that's exactly what happened. I don't know how many of those streaming or downloading services even exist anymore. Like, I truly could tell you, today I would not know where to look to download an album. Like, I don't know what services still exist, because I have no interest in it. I don't need it. I can just get what I want on Spotify. The things I choose to support extra, I'll buy on vinyl. I'll buy merchandise from them. And it's the best I can do as a consumer right now. But to your point, that has created a revenue stream that didn't exist before. And the labels are happier for it. The problem is the artists are not necessarily happier for this arrangement. And I don't, and this is where I push back against the artists, because I refuse to believe it was better for them in the days right before Spotify, when pirating had become so huge that music sales were just completely tanked. There was no revenue stream there whatsoever. So while I agree with the artists that their revenue share is not what it should be, it's not commensurate to what they put into it. On the other hand, I also think that it was not better for them if streaming never existed. I just simply don't think that, because that's just not the trend that this was going right before the big streaming services hit the world.
Yeah, one of the other things that I love in this current environment is when a band does something like Patreon. They take the fan club thing, they charge money for it, and they deliver value. And I love it. But I also understand, and I read a lot of comments on social media from musicians who kind of resent the fact that they also, in addition to being musicians and songwriters and performers, they also now have to be content creators, and they have to do extra performances and fill up extra timelines to create that value and fulfill free t-shirts and all the other things that people tend to do for Patreon supporters, live chats and whatever else. So I get that side of it, but I also think that there's an empowerment to it, that these bands now have an avenue that didn't exist before.
And to your point there about the content creation side of it, like, I even think of like a band like Holy Fawn, a band that you and I both absolutely love. They have a private Discord. They invite fans into this private Discord every now and then. I know Craig just recently got added to it and was very happy about that.
Finally.
But they've ran into that, created like almost its own set of complications, because so all of a sudden, not only did they make promises that they then had to deliver on, but they started to do like exclusive. I know, like when they did, they recently put out Realms on vinyl and made it exclusive to the Discord, which is awesome. Like, that was great. I bought it, got my copy, no problem. I was happy. However, there was a problem with the vendor, and about 50% of the people who ordered it never got it. So now all those people are mad at Holy Fawn, when Holy Fawn was trying to do a cool thing and give something extra to the people. It's supposed to be a win-win. It helps the band, it helps the fans. Now all of a sudden you've created a situation where the fans are mad about it. So like, that's just a whole other level of headache that gets introduced into this, that really, quite frankly, sucks for the bands to have to deal with that. And a band like Holy Fawn isn't popular enough that they can't hire tons of people to handle all of this. Like, they're doing a lot of this work themselves, the band members. They're the ones who have to make the phone calls, get in touch with the vendor, figure out what the hell went on. They don't have the legal support behind them to throw their weight and force them to take them seriously. They have to sit there on hold for who knows how long and get the runaround a million times. It's awful, and so it sucks.
Yeah, it's another one of those scenarios where you kind of need to have money to make money. You need a full-time employee to fulfill all those customer service requests, because I mean, in my real life, I run a customer service operation, and it's hard. It's hard. You've got customers now, and they've paid money, and they deserve to have fulfillment on the stuff they paid money for. Yeah, it's just, it's always been messy to be an artist and try and make money, and it's just a different kind of messy now. And I guess back to this law, I hope it cleans a couple of things up, but I have questions. I think it's just another place for things to get messy and for people to feel like they're not being served.
Yeah. Going back to the law too, one thing I was going to mention, in the statement Rashida put out about it, I don't know if this was a direct quote from her or if it was just in the blog article that she put out, but it mentioned that right now, currently, it takes an artist more than 800,000 monthly streams to equal a full-time $15 an hour job, a minimum wage job. And like, when I saw that, it was really quite staggering to me because I didn't realize just how bad that is. And I presume that means for, a band where you have 4 members, you have to do 4 times that for each member to be able to make a minimum wage living, versus, the solo artist. So that it just goes to show why this act exists, what problem it's attempting to solve. I hope that they can get some support behind it and get something done. I'm a little skeptical of that, but I'm certainly rooting for it.
There was some criticism of that framing, by the way, and I think it's effective framing because it contextualizes how many streams you need to make a minimum wage. But the idea that you were going to be able to just post your music on streaming services and make a living and retire, like, no,
Right.
you got to, if you're going to be a musician who does it professionally all the time, you have to go on tour, you have to sell t-shirts, you got to do all the things. And that's mostly always been the case until you hit the giant big time. But even then, you still have to do all those things. It's just you have more of a team helping you accomplish all those things.
That's when you have Pearl Jam LLC.
There you go.
Run your business. See, full circle, made it back to Pearl Jam. I didn't have to force in the reference. But no, I wanted to ask you too. One thing I didn't understand when I read the actual bill. Did you understand this distinction? 90% of the payout goes to eligible featured artists, and 10% goes to eligible non-featured artists. What is the difference between a featured artist and a non-featured artist?
So the featured artist would be the named artist. There are going to be exceptions to this, but the non-featured artist would be like your session drummer, your session musicians.
Oh, okay. So yeah,
and the fact that Rashida Tlaib is from Michigan, the Detroit area, there's always been a huge history of those session musicians who played on some of the biggest Motown hits of all time, who were just complete unknowns. They were paid tens of dollars, maybe hundreds of dollars if they got lucky, and they had to sign away all the rights, and they never got any residuals.
Okay. Yeah, so that makes sense then. When I read that, I was like, what do they mean? I was like, are they like separating like what a like mainstream artist is versus non-mainstream? But that makes a lot more sense. Yeah.
So last but not least, and I feel like I can say this as somebody who posts music to get a dozen streams. If you're like me and you're borderline hobbyist or an absolute hobbyist, and you don't have any critical mass of fans, you're still not going to make any money. There's no, if you're not putting in the work and you're not building the fan base and you're not getting your music heard on playlists on Spotify, on playlists on Apple Music, and doing all the things you need to do in terms of promotion. I know artists who still mail out promo copies, and because email doesn't work, they mail out promo copies of their stuff to all the college radio stations across America. You're not going to be able to just say, "Oh, finally, I'm going to get paid for my work." Like, no, you still. There are a lot of people who think that they're about to make a living, and they're not.
Yeah, to be clear, this is not a government handout. This is a restructuring of a business model in order to make it more tenable for a certain population of that.
But if it does come to pass, and it is effective, it's going to directly impact your and my favorite bands. So the people who love the bands that aren't playing basketball arenas, or who might be the second opener on the tour of the basketball arenas, it's going to massively impact them, which is cool.
Yep, absolutely. So, I'm all for it.
All right. I don't think there's anything else for us to talk about on this topic.
Yeah, I think we nailed it.
And we even dovetailed the Pearl Jam to Pearl Jam at the beginning to the end.
That's right.
That's your third drink, everybody. So the Pearl Jam drinking game is in effect.
And just Get your drinking workouts and exercise in, because next week we're gonna have a new Pearl Jam song to at least talk about.
Oh man, and forget when the album comes out, you guys are
That's
doomed.
gonna be an episode. You guys are screwed, because that's gonna be an episode. I promise you.
All right. Well, thanks so much for listening, everybody. We'll talk to you next time. It's been the Album of Record podcast.